And what a religion of drive is the idea that lack and unknowing and doubt is not the result necessarily of hyper-presence, nor of the fact that we can never connect with the ground of being. We can never connect with this thing that we call the absolute or God. But rather that in the lack itself is where we connect with the absolute, right? Because the absolute is self-divided. We are divided. We have lack within us. We are creatures of desire, creatures who can never be satisfied with some object. But, and I think I said this at the beginning, is that drive, you're satisfied by the lack, right? So in desire, you're never fully satisfied, right? You always feel a wee bit dissatisfied. In drive, when you in a sense are able to make space for drive, you can directly enjoy your not having. You can directly enjoy your sacrifice. You can directly enjoy gift, which is giving without a return, right? A pure loss. And a religion of drive, and when I say that this doesn't exist, it does. It exists everywhere all the time throughout human history. But an institution of drive religion, I don't think exists yet. A denomination of death drive doesn't quite exist. I think it's always at work, because drive is always at work. But the denomination of death drive, which is what I'm calling this talk, is a liturgy that directly enjoys unknowing and lack, and sees that in that embrace we connect with the absolute. So I'm going to say a couple more things about that, and then if you've got any questions, stick them in. I should have said this at the beginning, but if you put a Q before you put the question, then I can probably see it more easily. But hey, why is this connected to Christianity? Is that what I want to talk about? Oh, yes. It's connected to this notion of the death of God, right? Now, the death of God is connected, obviously, with this crucifixion of Christ image that we have, right? Which is very, very important and central. But within radical theology of someone like Thomas Altizer, this crucifixion is itself a mythological retelling, or a kind of a reenactment of the original death of God. And we see this in Simone Weil. So I'll talk about Simone Weil for a second, but she's almost similar to Paul Tillich, right? Imagine, here's a creation myth, right? So before the beginning, we cannot really speak of what this singularity is, right? So in this mythological language, someone like Simone Weil says, well, what's the first thing that's created? And for Weil, she says, well, the singularity, this is before space and time, or when all space and all time are collapsed, right? So everything is collapsed, right? Well, the first thing that's created has to be nothingness itself, right? So the first thing that you have to create in order to create the universe is the space for the universe to be, right? Space and time. And so what's interesting about this is it's the idea of what Freud would call a primary narcissism, right? Is a contraction. The singularity has to contract into itself in order to create space for nothing. And then out of that nothing, the universe to arise. And it's a beautiful analogy, because this happens, if you think about it in terms of an infant. An infant, in order to become a self, engages in what's called primary narcissism, right? Which is where you contract into yourself and you start to be concerned about you, right? You're not just immersed in the mother other, you see yourself and you're brought into yourself. And narcissism is very closely connected to the idea of evil, which we'll talk about now, in a second, is because if you think of what morality is empathy. Morality is my connection and my wovenness into the other, taking into consideration the other's needs and desires. And when I am in pain, So one of Freud's central insights is narcissism is always connected to pain. Everyone's a narcissist when they hit their little finger with a hammer, right? You do not care about Ukraine, you do not care about Gaza, you do not care about anything when you hit your finger with a hammer. You're a pure narcissist. You're thinking that your little finger is more important than world politics and what's happening, right? We can't help it. You can't help it. You know, your finger is so sore. And, you know, the Nazis did horrific experiments designed to see how the social bond could be broken, where they would have family members having to take electric shocks or give them to their children, right? So the idea was, at what point can you put someone through so much suffering that you break the bond with the loved one, the other? And that's kind of an example, and it's a horrible example, but of how pain brings us inward into ourselves, and then empathy and love is what weaves us into the other. But there's a story in which, for Freud, there's what's called a primary narcissism, as in we have to have that contraction in order to create a space between us. And then that allows for morality, that allows for us to overcome narcissism by reconnecting with the other, but with a sense of self. And you can see this in the creation myth of Simone Weil, where the first thing God has to do is the act of evil, right? The act of contraction into itself. And this is how you can connect with the idea of evil and is part of creation, etc., etc. So there's this contraction inward that creates a space for nothingness itself, and therefore for this reconnection. So, the reason why I'm saying all of that, is because that means the death of God is the very first act of God, right? In this creation story, the very first thing that the Absolute does is die. And the death of the Absolute is the formation of the universe. And therefore, what we see in the Christological example is a retelling of the death of God in history. And the liturgy, which is the liturgy of the Church of the Contradiction, is a liturgy that invites people to participate in the death of God in their own subjective life. So the death of God isn't something that happens at a certain point in the history of the cosmos. In some respects, the death of God is the cosmos itself. It is the very first act of creation. As I say, then it is enacted in history. That's the Hegelian idea. And the Church of the Contradiction, the denomination of Drive, is the space in which, through music and comedy and cabaret and exposition and poetry and other forms of art, this death of God is something that we invite into ourselves. And that's why I call it communion. A communion is a meal gathered around a shared loss, the death of God, right? So communion is a meal around the death of God. And so the Church of the Drive, the denomination of the Drive, is a place in which we enact communion, so that when we enter into the world, we can obviously create communities, and we'll have identities that we share with some people, etc., but at a more fundamental level, when we see the other, we will realize that they are other to us, we are other to them, they are other to them, and we are other to ourselves. And that otherness is what we share with each other, and that otherness has resonance with this notion of the death of God.